Welcome to the Crazy Alchemist Podcast, where alchemy, occultism, and strange history come alive.
The creature has no antlers. That needs to be said first, because the image most people carry in their heads, the towering figure with a deer skull for a face and a crown of elk antlers, is a modern invention. It appears nowhere in Ojibwe, Cree, or any other Algonquin oral tradition. The antlered wendigo emerged from 21st century horror films and video games. It is a visual shorthand that looks striking on a movie poster but has nothing to do with what the northern peoples actually described. What they described was worse. A human body stretched to impossible height, 15 feet tall or more, gaunt beyond starvation, skin pulled so tight over the bones that every rib and vertebra showed. The lips were chewed away or missing entirely, bitten off by the creature's own teeth in its first frenzy of hunger, leaving a permanent rictus that exposed the gums. The eyes burned like coals sunk deep in hollow sockets. The smell was rotting flesh. The feet were so large they left tracks the size of snowshoes in the snow. And it was always hungry. The wendigo grew larger with every person it consumed, but its appetite grew faster than its body. The more it ate, the bigger it became, and the bigger it became, the more it needed. Satisfaction was structurally impossible. The creature was a hunger that fed on feeding and could never stop. The wendigo belongs to the Algonquin-speaking peoples of subarctic North America, the Ojibwe, also called Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Naskapi, the Innu. Each nation has its own name for the creature. The Ojibwe say Windigo. The Cree say wétiko or wétiko. The Naskapi and Innu say Achen. The variations in spelling across English sources, wendigo, windigo, wétiko, wétigo, are transliterations of related but distinct Algonquin words. The English word wétiko is attested in writing as early as 1714, 2 centuries before any popular novel made the creature famous. The geography matters. These peoples lived in the boreal forests and tundra of what is now central and northern Canada, extending into the northern reaches of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Winters lasted 6 months or longer. Temperatures dropped to 40 below. Small bands of hunters, sometimes no more than a dozen people, lived in isolation for months at a time, entirely dependent on hunting and trapping. When the game vanished, there was nothing. No stored grain, no livestock, no neighboring village within walking distance. People starved, people died, and in the worst winters, the ones that persisted beyond all reasonable hope, people faced a choice that the Wendigo myth was designed to answer. The most common path to becoming a Wendigo is cannibalism. A person who eats human flesh during famine, even to survive, opens themselves to transformation. The act itself is the trigger. Once the taboo is broken, the process begins and cannot be reversed. The person develops an insatiable craving for more. They begin to see the people around them as prey. Their body changes. They grow larger, stronger, faster, but always hungrier. The human mind recedes. What replaces it is a single consuming drive to feed. The second path is possession. In Cree tradition, the wendigo is a spirit that can enter a person through a dream or through a bite. The possessed individual becomes violent, paranoid, and fixated on human flesh. They may recognize what is happening to them. In several recorded accounts, people who believed they were becoming wendigos begged their families to kill them before the transformation was complete. A third, less common path is greed. Some traditions hold that a person who hoards food while others starve, who prioritizes their own survival over the group's, who takes more than their share, is exhibiting the early symptoms of wendigo sickness. The creature is not always triggered by literal cannibalism. Sometimes the metaphor is the whole point. Consuming others to feed yourself, whether with your teeth or your selfishness, is the same spiritual disease. In all three pathways, the physical transformation follows a pattern. The skin turns gray or ashen, the body elongates beyond human proportions, the lips disappear, a heart of ice forms in the chest, and as long as it remains frozen, the creature lives. The ice heart is the most distinctive physiological detail in Wendigo lore. It appears consistently across multiple Algonquin traditions and is central to both the creature's nature and its cure. A person in the early stages of Wendigo sickness, before the transformation is complete, could sometimes be treated. The documented remedy involved administering hot tallow or bear grease to the afflicted person, forcing them to vomit. What came up, according to multiple accounts recorded by missionaries and traders, was ice, chunks of ice from inside the body. The symbolic logic is direct. The Wendigo is associated with winter, cold, starvation, and death. The ice heart represents the freezing of human compassion, the replacement of warmth and connection with cold and hunger. Vomiting the ice meant expelling the condition before it became permanent. Once the heart froze completely, treatment was impossible. The only recourse was execution, followed by burning. Several accounts describe the heart as being physically present in the chest cavity of the killed creature, a mass of ice that had to be melted separately because it would not burn. In the winter of 1878 to 1879, a Cree man named Swift Runner was living with his wife and 6 children near Fort Edmonton in what is now Alberta. The winter was severe. The family was isolated and running out of food. A Hudson's Bay Company trading post was only about 25 miles away, close enough to reach on foot, even in deep snow. Swift Runner did not walk to the post. Instead, over the course of the winter, he killed and ate his wife and all 6 children. When he emerged in the spring, alone, his story immediately aroused suspicion. The Northwest Mounted Police investigated and found the campsite littered with human bones, some cracked for marrow. Swift Runner claimed a Wendigo spirit had possessed him. He said the spirit entered his dreams and commanded him to eat. At his trial in 1879, the court rejected the defense. He was found guilty of murder and hanged at Fort Saskatchewan on December 20, 1879. He was the first person executed under Canadian law in what is now Alberta. The case is complicated by several factors. The trading post was within reach. Swift Runner was a large, physically capable man who could have made the journey. Other families in the same region survived that winter without resorting to cannibalism. And he did not eat only to survive. He consumed the entire family, when a single death might have sustained the others. The case reads less like a person driven to extremity by starvation and more like something else, something the Cree had a name for long before European courts arrived. Jack Fiddler, an Oji-Cree shaman of the Sandy Lake First Nation in northern Ontario, claimed to have killed 14 Wendigos during his lifetime. He was the community's recognized authority on Wendigo possession, the person families turned to when someone showed the signs. In 1907, Canadian authorities charged Jack and his brother Joseph with the murder of a woman named Ojibwe, Joseph's daughter-in-law. The Fiddlers had strangled her at her own family's request. She was believed to be in the late stages of Wendigo transformation, and the community considered her execution a preventative necessity, the same way a village might kill a person showing signs of a deadly contagion before it spread. The Canadian legal system saw it as murder. Jack Fiddler escaped custody and hanged himself before trial. Joseph was convicted and sentenced to death, later commuted to life imprisonment. He died in prison 3 days before a full pardon arrived. The case crystallized a collision between 2 legal and cosmological systems. In Oji-Cree tradition, killing a person who was becoming a Wendigo was not murder. It was a medical intervention, a spiritual obligation, and a community protection measure, analogous to quarantine. The Canadian state had no framework for recognizing any of this. To the court, a shaman had strangled a sick woman. In 1960, Morton Teicher published Windigo Psychosis, a study that cataloged 70 reported cases of wendigo-related behavior from the 17th century through the 20th. Teicher treated the phenomenon as a genuine culture-bound psychiatric syndrome, a condition specific to a particular cultural context in which the afflicted person develops paranoia, nausea, depression, and an obsessive craving for human flesh. It was the clinical framing that dominated academic discussion for decades. In 1982, the anthropologist Lou Marano published a paper in Current Anthropology titled Windigo Psychosis, The Anatomy of an Emic-Etic Confusion. Marano's argument was explosive. After 5 years of fieldwork among the northern Ojibwe and Cree and extensive archival research, he concluded that there probably never were any genuine wendigo psychotics, no cases in which a person committed cannibalism to satisfy an obsessive craving for human flesh as described in the clinical literature. He called the syndrome a fabrication and an artifact of research conducted with bias. Marano reframed the question. Instead of asking what causes a person to become a cannibalistic maniac, he asked under what circumstances a northern Algonquin person would be accused of becoming one. His answer was socio-political. Those executed as wendigos were victims of triage homicide, or witch hunts, events common in small societies under severe stress. The psychosis was an accusation, not a diagnosis. Robert Brightman responded in 1988, arguing in Ethnohistory that Marano's dismissal relied on a colonial standard of evidence. Marano had discredited indigenous accounts because no European witness had observed the behavior firsthand. Brightman pointed out that numerous credible accounts existed, both indigenous and otherwise, spanning centuries. The absence of a European observer at the moment of transformation did not invalidate the phenomenon. The debate remains unresolved. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual does not list wendigo psychosis. Some scholars treat it as a real culture-bound syndrome. Others treat it as a socio-dynamic phenomenon, a form of accusation rather than illness. Others argue the distinction itself is Western and unhelpful, that analyzing the wendigo within Algonquin cosmology rather than through psychiatric categories would produce different conclusions entirely. The earliest written record of the wendigo appears in the Jesuit Relations and Allied Documents, the annual reports sent by Jesuit missionaries in New France to their superiors in Paris. Paul Jeune, a French Jesuit who served as superior of the Jesuits in New France from 1632 to 1639, described the creature in his 1636 report. He wrote of a woman who warned of a cannibalistic supernatural being that had devoured members of the Atacamagucan and of an Achin, described as a sort of werewolf that would come in its place. Lejeune reinterpreted the accounts through a Christian framework as demonic possession, but the indigenous descriptions he recorded matched the Wendigo tradition precisely. Later entries in the Relations continued to document the phenomenon. A 1661 report describes cannibalistic killings among the Cree during a brutal winter. The Jesuits were eyewitnesses to the environment that produced the Wendigo, the endless boreal forest, the months of darkness, the isolation of small bands cut off from any outside contact, the absolute dependence on hunting in a landscape where game could simply disappear. The Wendigo tradition makes no sense without its landscape. The boreal forests of central Canada are among the harshest environments on Earth for human habitation. Winter temperatures regularly reach -40 degrees. Snow covers the ground for 6 to 8 months. The forest is vast, hundreds of thousands of square miles of spruce and birch, thinning to tundra in the north. Travel between camps could take days or weeks. A hunting band that exhausted the local game had no fallback. Starvation was not theoretical, it was seasonal. Every winter carried the possibility that the caribou would not come, the moose would move, the fish would not be where they were last year. Cannibalism during famine is documented across human cultures worldwide. What makes the Algonquin response distinctive is the mythological architecture built around it. They did not simply prohibit cannibalism, they created a creature that embodied the act and its consequences, a teaching tool encoded as a monster. The Wendigo's core paradox, that it grows larger with every meal but is never less hungry, is a precise description of addiction and greed. The more you take, the more you need. The creature is permanently in deficit. It cannot stop consuming because consumption itself generates the hunger. This is not a metaphor that requires literary analysis to decode. The people who created it knew exactly what they were describing. Basil Johnston, an Ojibwe author and scholar from the Cape Croker Reserve in Ontario, wrote in The Manitous, published in 1995, that the Wendigo represented the threat that any person could become a cannibal under sufficient pressure, and that the myth served as both a warning and a mirror. The creature was not an external threat from the forest, it was the threat inside the camp. The knowledge that any one of your companions might break under the strain of starvation and turn on the others. The Wendigo was the worst version of yourself. The Northwestern variant deserves a brief note. Among the Athabascan-speaking peoples of the Pacific Northwest, the cannibalistic counterpart is called the wétiko. The wétiko belongs to a different language family, but the shape of the figure is recognizably parallel, a person transformed by breaking taboo into something cannibalistic and other than human. The crucial difference is interpretation. Where the Algonquin Wendigo is unambiguously monstrous, the wétiko is sometimes framed as enlightened with ancestral insights, a being who has crossed into a different mode of perception. The contrast suggests how flexibly the same phenomenon can be morally coded by different cultures. In 1979, Jack Forbes, a scholar of Powhatan and Lenape descent, published Columbus and Other Cannibals, a work that took the Algonquin concept of wétiko and applied it far beyond its original context. Forbes argued that the Western colonial enterprise, from Columbus onward, exhibited the defining characteristics of Wendigo sickness, an insatiable appetite for consumption that grows with every conquest, an inability to recognize the humanity of those being consumed, and a contagious quality that spreads the disease to everyone it touches. Forbes proposed that wétiko was not a monster from folklore, but a diagnosis of a real and widespread human pathology, a spiritual sickness characterized by consuming the lives, resources, and labor of others for personal gain. Colonialism was wétiko. Capitalism was wétiko. The extraction of resources from the earth beyond any reasonable need was wétiko. Forbes argued that the Algonquin peoples had identified and named a disease that Western civilization not only failed to diagnose, but actively rewarded. The Anishinaabe activist and economist Winona LaDuke extended the concept further, using the term Wendigo economics to describe corporate practices that devour communities and ecosystems for profit. The creature that the boreal hunters created to enforce sharing and punish hoarding had become, in LaDuke's framing, a description of the global economic system. In 1910, the English writer Algernon Blackwood published The Wendigo, a novella that became the first major work of Western literature to feature the creature. Blackwood set his story in the wilderness of northern Ontario, where a hunting party is stalked by something immense and invisible that moves through the treetops at terrifying speed. Blackwood had traveled through the Canadian wilderness himself and understood the psychological weight of the landscape. His Wendigo is experienced primarily through sound and absence, footprints that start human and become something else, a voice calling from above the trees, a man who returns from his encounter changed, his feet blackened and swollen, his mind emptied of everything except the memory of being carried through the sky at impossible speed. The novella established the Wendigo as a figure in Western horror fiction, but Blackwood's approach was notably different from what came later. He kept the creature almost entirely unseen. The horror was psychological and environmental, rooted in the vastness of the forest and the smallness of humans within it. He did not give it antlers, a deer skull, or any specific visual form. The antlered wendigo emerged much later. The 2001 film Wendigo by Larry Fessenden depicted the creature as a composite figure with deer-like features. The 2015 video game Until Dawn gave it the now iconic deer skull face. Scott Cooper's film 2021 Antlers, produced by Guillermo del Toro, cemented the antlered visual in mainstream cinema. None of these depictions reflect traditional Algonquin descriptions. The wendigo occupies a different position than most creatures in folklore. The Strigoi of Romania, the Aswang of the Philippines, the Jiangxi of China. These belong to cultures that openly discuss them, depict them in art, and reference them in daily life without restriction. The wendigo does not. Many Anishinaabe people consider it taboo to speak the creature's name aloud, particularly at night or during winter. Speaking the name is believed to attract its attention. Visual depictions are traditionally avoided. The creature belongs to a living spiritual tradition, not to a historical folklore that has been safely filed away in archives. The Western entertainment industry has treated the wendigo as public domain content, a monster to be mined for horror films, video games, and novels. Some indigenous scholars and community members have objected to this appropriation, pointing out that stripping the creature from its cultural context and repurposing it as a generic villain erases its meaning and disrespects the people who created it. This episode documents what is publicly available in the ethnographic and historical record. It does not claim to represent the wendigo as understood within Anishinaabe, Cree, or other Algonquin spiritual practice. That understanding belongs to those peoples. The wendigo is not a monster in the way that Western culture uses the word. It is not an external threat that comes from outside and attacks the innocent. It is an internal threat. It is what a person becomes when they choose their own survival over the survival of the group, when they consume others to feed themselves, when their appetite overrides their humanity. The creature grows with every meal and is never full. It was human once and remembers being human. It lives in the coldest, most desolate landscape on the continent, the place where the temptation to break the taboo is greatest, because the consequences of not breaking it, starvation and death, are most immediate. Every culture that faces extreme scarcity develops rules about sharing. The Algonquin peoples encoded theirs in a creature so terrifying that the mere mention of its name could enforce generosity in a hunting camp where food was running low. The wendigo is a moral technology disguised as a nightmare. It works because it answers the question that matters most. Is survival worth it if the price is becoming that? The answer, encoded in 1,000 years of oral tradition across dozens of nations spanning half a continent, is no. If you enjoyed this episode and want more like it, the full bestiary entry with all the sources is on crazyalchemist.com. Subscribe for more dives into the real history and esoteric traditions hidden inside the things we read and watch. Thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to visit crazyalchemist.com for more intriguing content and follow Crazy Alchemist on Instagram and Facebook to stay connected.